Next up, we're going to hear from Dr. Cleo Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell is a professor and the chair of the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education, as well as the director of the Center for Research on Ethnicity, Culture, and Health here at the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. She is also a faculty associate with the Program for Research on Black Americans at the Institute for Social Research and an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan. Here at the University of Michigan Injury Prevention Center, she serves as a senior advisor for our Training and Education Corps, helping to train and mentor the next generation of injury prevention scientists. She also has extensive experience conducting research to understand health risk behaviors and the mental health of ethnically diverse adolescents, including African American and Caribbean Black youth. I welcome Dr. Caldwell, and I also would remind everyone to please type their questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box. Welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here to share some of our experiences conducting research in cities that have high levels of community violence as a background for conducting research on youth violence prevention. My research focused specifically on African American youth and families, and my goal here today is to provide some food for thought for planning youth violence prevention intervention research, particularly within communities that experience violence. Tragically, oops, I'm not moving. 75 to 80% of African American youth have witnessed community violence in their lifetime. This is particularly true when we consider the lives of African American youth and male youth specifically, that African American youth are more likely to experience community violence than others, and males are more likely than African American females to experience more community violence. These situations are important because they have implications. Witnessing violence have implications for experiencing poor mental health outcomes, as well as increased violence perpetration. The background, this was the background that was the basis of the work that we did in Flint. We initiated a violence youth prevention program in Flint, where we were using funding from the CDC and focusing with a community-based participatory kind of approach to develop an intervention for youth violence. Flint has experienced escalating community violence since the 1970s when General Motors moved out of this high levels of unemployment. Flint is a city that residents have a strong commitment to improving community life. So building on these issues, we use what's called a community-based participatory research methodological approach to be able to develop this intervention, working with several community organizations, working with the University of Michigan School of Public Health, working with the local health department, and working with African American families themselves in Flint. Our approach was to strengthen the relationship between non-resident African American fathers and their 8 to 12-year-old sons. Statistics show that 66% of African American youth under age 18 live in single parent households. So for that was a huge indication that we needed to focus on what was happening with non-resident families and African American boys in the Flint environment. What we did was we developed an intervention we called Flint Fathers and Sons Program that focuses on strengthening the parenting behaviors of non-resident fathers as a protection for their sons. We worked with almost 300 families in Flint, and some of our findings indicated that awareness of father involvement was related to sons' intentions to avoid violence in the future. Also, improving non-resident fathers' ability to talk about risky behaviors with their son was associated with less aggressive behavior. And what's important here is that risky behavior communication included generally talking about risky behaviors, but also race-related socialization. This was an important process where fathers were able to talk with their children about what it means to be a Black male in America. And also expectations for sexual behavior was an important part of this process. Coming out of that work in Flint, we wanted to see if we could replicate those findings. And we moved then to Chicago. We were able to get funding from the National Institutes of Health to be able to replicate what we had done in Flint in Chicago. And we were looking for a large urban city to be able to do this work, and a city that had a good transportation system. We thought Chicago was ideal because Chicago has very defined neighborhoods and an extensive transportation system. So we wanted to be able to use this new environment, this new social context, to see if we could replicate some of our findings from Flint. Chicago is one of the deadliest cities. Chicago is one of the deadliest cities in the United States. Murders increased by 53% and non-fatal shootings increased by 53% from 2019 to 2020. There are also a number of street gangs that are prominent in the South Side neighborhoods. 10 of Chicago's 77 communities drive the violence statistics, and 5 communities on the South Side made up 1/3 of Chicago's homicides in 2016. The other important statistic here is that 93% of the South Side residents are African Americans. So you can see that youth, African American youth specifically living on the South Side of Chicago, are exposed to a lot of community violence. Natalie Moore, who wrote a book about life on the South Side of Chicago, since it is such a unique experience, made a conclusion that we can't honestly talk about problems such as violence and unemployment without addressing segregation. And segregation is reflected in those segregated neighborhoods in Chicago. So what we build on as a strength for coming to Chicago, because of its well-defined neighborhoods, left us with some challenges when we confined ourselves to the South Side of Chicago to do our work, because it also represented disparities in resources and particularly economic opportunities. So things that have been done in Chicago to try to address the issue of gang violence, because street gang violence, particularly on the South Side of Chicago, is a key issue. Tougher police tactics, improve economic opportunities for those most disadvantaged by racial bias and discrimination, more effective social work engagement, and combined approaches involving the community, all have been the focus of what has been going on in Chicago to try to address the escalating youth violence there. What we're doing is we've moved into Chicago with the Chicago Fathers and Sons Study now, and this has been funded by the National Institutes of Health. And we're conducting a randomized controlled trial where we're comparing the parenting and health awareness program that we developed in Flint to Fathers and Sons Physical Activity and Nutrition Control Group. We're also conducting this work on the South Side of Chicago because that's an area with the greatest need. And we are collaborating with several community organizations to conduct this using a CBPR approach as well. Our goal is to involve approximately 200 non-resident African-American families. And in addition to the youth violence focus, we're also focusing on depression, drinking, and service use among fathers because their parenting behaviors have to be considered within the context of what's happening with fathers. In doing this work, we faced a number of challenges, and Chicago's South Side covers 50% of the city's land area. Travel time getting to and from programs have been challenging. Some families have shared with us that it takes them 4 hours in order to participate in the intervention. The distinct neighborhoods also have implications because of safety concerns among families. Families are reluctant to cross neighborhood boundaries due to unknown gangs. What families have said to us is they know the gangs in their own communities, but they don't know the gangs in other communities. So this makes it difficult for them to consider changing neighborhoods in order to participate in an intervention. So timing for scheduled activities, we were accustomed to doing our work 6 to 8 at night, and this can present challenges again for families because of exposure to violence. That also depends on the time of day that people are engaging in activities. An interesting one was the seasonal weather connection to violence. Here, when we were exposed to hazardous weather, That attenuated violence in communities. However, during the holiday season, even in the wintertime, violence escalated. And the other side of the coin was increased community of violence occurring in the warmer weather. So springtime and summertime resulted in more violence that families had to deal with as they tried to participate in intervention research. One of the things we learned was that mothers are critical to the recruitment process. So therefore, we interacted with mothers on a regular basis in terms of recruiting families, as well as letting them know what their children were doing and what the fathers were doing as a part of our intervention process. We had multiple locations. We had 2 research offices, and we also collaborated with a number of community partners to provide implementation sites that could be closer to where our families lived. When we say we're recruiting on the south side of Chicago, with that landmass, that was huge. That was enormous. So we had to have a number of community partners to be able to work with us to be able to provide sites that were closer to where families were located. Significance of consistent community engagement then became an important part of how we've been able to work in the Chicago community. The other thing is training local residents to be a part of our research team. We have local residents who conduct our intervention as facilitators, as observers, as data collectors, and as a part of our standard research team in Chicago for recruitment purposes. This is important because especially those residents who grew up on the south side of Chicago, they are not afraid to go into some of the communities that have experienced the most violence. We are working, for example, with housing developments. And in that situation, they only want people who are part of the housing development to come into the sites. But they have been a tremendous source of recruitment for us, but they also are very concerned about violence in the community. So therefore, we've changed the time of our intervention to be able to work with them. And we have a very good staff that works well going into these environments. Transportation assistance is also helpful, and this includes parking. Because parking, families can't walk long distances to come to an intervention. We have to make it as convenient as possible for them. And then actual recruitment for the program has been strong, but our biggest challenge has been retention more than anything else because of these experiences. One of the things that we do have is a very strong research staff that are thinking about these issues all the time. And this becomes important for us because we have learned in the research process, we have to be flexible in terms of working in communities that are experiencing these types of challenges. With that, I will end, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have and provide more specifics during the question and answer period if you have questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Caldwell. Fathers and Sons is such a great program, and I was so happy you could come and tell us about it. I think we do have time for one or maybe 1 or 2 questions. The first question I have is you spoke very eloquently about how you developed the program in Flint and had a significant amount of community input through the community-based participatory research process. I wonder about adaptations that you had to make as you moved the program to Chicago in terms of a cultural context. You talked a lot about some of the challenges that you had to overcome sort of from the research end, but I wonder about cultural adaptations that you felt you had to make.
So this is really a very good question because that was important for us. And working again with the staff that we had in Chicago, working with our community partners, one of the first things they did was try to orient us as to where we were. So when we did simple things like facilitator training, for example, we're focusing on the content that the facilitators have to deliver. In the midst of that, we had one in role play. This was just role play. We had one person playing a father who jumped up and pulled out a gun and said, this can happen in these kinds of environments. So we actually have to be prepared. We have a no firearm or no weapons rule for coming into the intervention, but you never know. So one of the things we do is we find secure sites. One of the sites that we work with, they keep their doors locked all the time. And so that was different for us because we were used to people just coming in. For families, we spend a lot of time talking about safety. And that's something we didn't have to do in Flint, although Flint actually had a high crime rate at the time. It was different. On the news every day, people are talking about violence in Chicago. It's picked up on the national news. It's picked up everywhere. So our participants are keenly aware of some of the dangers. And therefore, we worked with our staff as well as our steering committee there that we have in order to try to make sure that we were putting procedures in place that would ensure the families of their safety.
So important to have that community context and that community input, and I thank you for highlighting that. We did have one other question in the chat, probably our final question for this session, was about how whether or not there's value in moving even further upstream. Your program really deals with that sort of father and son's relationship, but is there value in even looking further upstream for youth violence prevention? And I wonder your thoughts about that.
So we think about families within the context of communities. So it's going to be very important, even from a policy perspective, to be able to address some of the challenges that families face. In our case, we're dealing with non-resident fathers. And one of the things that we know, we encourage within the context of our intervention, monitoring, for example. And as a part of that, school work of the child becomes important to do. But we found in both Flint and in Chicago, the fathers are not the ones, because they're non-resident, who get information about their own children. So thinking with regard to policies that actually put in place, making sure that both parents who are involved in the child's life receive this kind of information. So we need to address these at the institutional level, as opposed to the individual family level. And that becomes an important part. There are a number of other policies that we believe are really important in order to support fathers' ability to parent. One of the studies that we had as a complement to this study was a fathers and sons policy study that identified or tried to identify supportive policies for fathers, for fatherhood, and we couldn't find very many. Most of the policies were very, very, negative when it came to what can we do to support fathers' involvement. So President Obama, when he was president, did create a My Brother's Keeper initiative that began to bring more focus to responsible fatherhood type programs.
So important, that positive development and positive father-son relationship. So I really thank you for joining us today and for your presentation on your work. It's great.